The second lesson is taken from the Gospel according to Matthew, from the 14th chapter. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. When the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish." He said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves and gave it to his disciples, and the disciples gave it to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Let us pray. Lord, into your presence we come. And we come from different spiritual places. Meet us where we are and open our hearts to you. Amen. The story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish was so important to the early disciples that it is the only miracle story that is included in all 4 of the Gospels. It's a story we both love and we wonder about. And it begins with an important line of context that we often miss. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. When Jesus heard this, what Jesus had heard was the awful news that John the Baptist had been killed. And it was awful for a lot of reasons. What we sometimes fail to remember is that John the Baptist was more than the scathing prophet whose mission was to prepare the way for Jesus. No, John was family. He was Jesus' cousin, Elizabeth's son. You remember from the Christmas story that when Mary became pregnant, confused and unsettled, she went and sought out and stayed with her relative, Elizabeth, for 3 months. Now, we don't know whether Elizabeth, as a relative, was her aunt or maybe her cousin. Either way, these 2 women were connected by blood and family. So we imagine then that John and Jesus, who were about the same age, grew up together. As their families visited, they played and formed a relationship that can often develop among cousins. I mean, for me, growing up with cousins has produced some of the most important relationships of my life. That was the news Jesus heard. His cousin, John, had been beheaded by Herod, a psychotic king. You remember that story? Herod had imprisoned John the Baptist because John had criticized Herod's marriage to Herodias, who was the divorced wife of Herod's half-brother Philip. And part of that story was that Herod had wooed the heart of his then married brother Philip, wooed the heart of his wife, which did not sit well with John. However, Herod the politician was afraid to have the popular prophet John killed, so he had him imprisoned. So fast forward a bit, and when the king's new wife's daughter danced before guests at this lavishly thrown royal banquet, the king was taken by his stepdaughter, that he promised her for whatever she asked. Enter Herodias, the girl's mother, who was infuriated and humiliated that John would condemn her marriage, and so with her mother's instruction, the girl demanded the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Herod, weak and caught and psychotic, but caught in this promise he had made, and with John in the dungeon below, well, he did just that. It was violent, disgusting, barbaric, senseless. That was the news. That was the news Jesus heard as this story begins. His cousin had been beheaded. Now, when Jesus heard this, says Matthew, he withdrew in a boat to a deserted place by himself. We get it. Stunned, grieving, heartsick, Jesus seeks to be by himself. Now, apparently, Jesus had been teaching all day. And by this time in his ministry, he was drawing crowds. And when people heard that Jesus had left in a boat, they followed him. And when Jesus came ashore, there was a sea of people waiting for him. Of course, they didn't know. They didn't know that Jesus had just learned that his cousin had been beheaded. They didn't know about Jesus' grief or his heart sickness. They just wanted to be near Jesus. But we can imagine what could have run through Jesus' mind when he saw that huge crowd of people waiting for him when he walked onto the shore. I wonder if he were not just tempted to get back in the boat and take off. Or I've wondered if he just wouldn't tell the crowd, take a hike, because he was too emotionally distraught to speak God's truth in that moment. But Matthew says, when Jesus, went ashore and saw a great crowd, he had compassion for them. Compassion means to have sympathy and concern for people who are suffering or who have suffered misfortune. sympathy, empathy. That's the heart of Jesus, even in his grief. That's the heart of God. But day turned to dusk, and it was a deserted place, so the disciples came to Jesus and said, send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy some food for themselves. I mean, it is the end of the day. These people are hungry. Most of them live the hard-scrabble life of one meal to another. And the disciples, they're pragmatists. They know the problem, a huge crowd, and they're hungry, and they know the solution. Send them into the villages where they can get something to eat. And then Jesus says something startling to his 12 friends, the disciples. You give them something to eat. Now, I wish I could have eavesdropped on the disciples' reaction when they heard that. Not sure I heard you right there, Jesus. You didn't say for us to feed them, did you? Matthew says the disciples' response was, we have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. Which meant, of course, that they knew enough math to know that with this meager amount, they might only be able to feed themselves, the 12 and Jesus, but they had looked at the crowd. They had assessed their need. 5 plus 2 does not feed thousands. Anyone could see that this was not enough. Anyone but Jesus. Jesus ordered the few loaves and the fish to be brought to him there on this hillside. Now, several years ago, Kathy and I were part of an ecumenical group from Greensboro that went to the Holy Land. And one of the places that I enjoyed most was this place where by history and by tradition, Jesus fed the 5,000. It's beside the Sea of Galilee, which is really a lake that is a huge lake, 13 miles long, 8 miles wide. You can see the mountains of Lebanon off in the distance, and there's this green, grassy hillside that slopes down to the water. And standing there, you can see how this place served as a natural amphitheater with speech being amplified by the water, and where people could sit on this hill that went for 100 or several hundred yards there, sloping down. Jesus told the crowd to sit, and with loaves and fish, he looked into heaven, he blessed it, he broke it, and then he gave it to the disciples, who then gave it to the crowd. I mean, it has images of the communion table, doesn't it? All ate, and all were filled, says Matthew. And if that were not enough, the tellers of the story say they had a dozen baskets of leftovers. What happened? What happened? We don't know, really. A lot of armchair theologians have had explanations and theories about what happened, but in the end, we don't know. We don't know exactly what happened. Some say it might have happened the way an event unfolded now some years ago on a crowded airplane. Parker Palmer, author and teacher, writes about an experience he had on an airplane some years ago before security lines and TSA screening and before there were all these prohibitions about what one could take on a plane. He was on this flight from going to Denver, and the plane had pulled away from the gate, and they'd gone to the farthest point out from the airport on the runway, and then they stopped. And they stayed there for a very long time, and finally the captain came on and he said, I have some bad news. There is a bad storm in the west exactly where we are headed. The Denver airport is socked in and closed down, so we're going to be here for a few hours. That's the bad news. The worst news is that we have no food on board this plane. Now that's a crisis, right? And so there was this audible groan from the passengers, and some of the passengers got visibly upset. Then Palmer says, one of the flight attendants stood up in the aisle and took the microphone and said, we're really sorry, folks. We didn't plan it this way, and there's not anything that we can do about it. And we know that for some of you, this is a big deal, that you're hungry and that some of you may have medical conditions and really need to eat, and some of you just may not care. So I have an idea. We have a couple of empty baskets up here, and we're going to pass them around, and everybody put something in the basket. I know that some of you brought little snacks, peanut butter crackers, candy bars, Rolaids, Lifesavers, chewing gum. And if you don't have anything edible, if you have a business card or a picture of your family, whatever, I hope that everyone will put something in the basket. And then we'll reverse the process. We'll pick up the baskets and we'll pass them around, and anyone can take out what he or she needs. Palmer says that what happened next was amazing. First, the complaining and the griping stopped, and people started sifting through their pockets and in their handbags and in their briefcases, and some stood and retrieved the luggage from the bins above. They got out boxes of candy and salami and cheese and Italian sausage and crackers and bottles of wine. This was a long time ago when you could do it. And now people were laughing and they were talking, because this flight attendant had transformed a group of anxious, griping, grumpy people focused on what they didn't have or what they had lost into a gracious community of sharing. From a community of with a scarcity mindset to a community where abundance was the joyful measure of the day. Is something like that what happened on the Sea of Galilee that day? I don't know. We don't know. If it was something like that, the miracle then is what happens in people's hearts when we stop focusing on what we don't have and start sharing what we do have, right? I mean, that's a miracle of the Spirit. That's the Jesus Spirit. And the way it transforms the way we think about life. You with me? I mean, do you want to be around people who are always focusing on what they don't have? Or people who are thankful and joyful and gracious and ready to share what they do have? Well, that is one of the lessons in this story, to be sure. The transformation from a mindset of scarcity to a mindset of abundance and generosity. But beyond that, the lesson that most resonates with me is seeing the disciples with their little vision and their limited faith and their small pragmatic world that is so full of obstacles and reasonable roadblocks. I mean, they can only see the reasonable, right? 5,000 hungry people, 5 loaves, and 2 fish. I mean, this is never going to work. It is as if they just cannot comprehend that they have the greatest coach the game has ever seen, right? I mean, this guy is undefeated. He takes crumbling, mediocre, talented teams to the playoffs every year. But they just can't see it. Or maybe they don't want to see it. They can't see how big God is. They can't see how generous God is, how compassionate God's heart is, how powerful God is. In the sense that God can accomplish God's purposes regardless of the circumstance. And I am thinking that is my sin. That is my sin. Maybe yours. We become so pragmatic, so reasonable that we forget who our coach is. We forget that God does not care about the obstacles, only God's purposes being fulfilled. So rather than trusting, or rather than daring to trust, or imagine that God can transform what looks like an overwhelmingly pessimistic circumstance, we sit on the sidelines with all the pragmatic disciples. And all of them have come armed with a boatload of data to support their reasonable outlooks. 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 people to feed. Only Fishy Math could envision a good outcome. Think about those bad relationships that we're in, the ones that have gone off the rail and that we have given up on because they seem so hopeless. Think about our cynicism when it comes to the real obstacles that we see in overcoming homelessness or hunger or poverty or racism or prejudice, like we saw this weekend in Charlottesville, or dealing with opioid addiction, an epidemic in almost every community in this country. But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And if we're listening, you and me, or as this congregation, we just have to be startled by the words of Jesus. You give them something to eat. What? Me? I have nothing. I'm too old. I'm too young. I've already done my part. It's not my gift. My plate is so full. Yes, you. Because the miracle happens when people of faith, like you and me, start distributing fish and bread into what looks like an unwinnable circumstance, a complex situation, a problem that is plaguing us or our family or our workplace or our church or our community. How it happens? Well, how it happens and what happens, that's up to God. The only thing we need to hear is, you give them. You give them. You give them.